Well, hi everyone. Ken Ham, CEO of Answers Genesis, Creation Museum, the Ark Encounter, along with Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, PhD in biology from Harvard University, continuing the series, The New History of the Human Race. Well, new history, it's the Bible's history. Well, it's history that genetics is revealing a lot of very interesting things. And Dr. Jeanson's gone through, wow, what have we done now? 20 episodes already. This is number 21. And you can see all the previous ones on answers.tv. You covered a whole range of topics and very interesting things about the history of the human race. We're more closely related than we realized. And a lot of these cultures have come about in recent times much more quickly than we realize. All sorts of fascinating information. And so he's been using the Y chromosome. I'll let Dr. Jeanson explain that to you. But this one is going to be on the Neanderthals. And the Neanderthals, well, when I grew up, I went to museums and they were sort of these brute creatures, sort of looking half like apes and humans and bent over and living in caves as sort of, primitive creatures somehow evolving into humans. That's how it was when I was a youngster, what I was taught about Neanderthals. But who were the Neanderthal people and what became of them and when did they live? And well, actually, Dr. Jeanson is going to share some interesting insights from the research that he's done. Now, let me also, and I'll say this again at the end, that once we do 21 today and then 22 for tomorrow, then next week, 23 will sort of be the final one, and then we'll have a 24, which will be a question time. You can actually put the questions you want to ask in this particular program. So as it's being broadcast, you just in the comments there put the questions that you want to ask, and Dr. Jeanson will collect those. Also, we're going to use a different program, and we hope to have for number 24 actually live comments, so that you can have live questions and ask those questions live of Dr. Jeanson. Try to ask him some hard ones too, some really difficult ones. So Dr. Jeanson for today, for episode 21, the new history of the human race, Neanderthals. I'll turn it over to you.
I have a feeling that after today's episode and tomorrow's episode, when I step on a lot of toes, this will generate all sorts of questions, and I look forward to them. But please, yes, submit your questions. I know we're going to have some viewers in different time zones. Some may not be able to make it. It'll be Sunday night in 7 p.m. Eastern time. So it'll be June 14th in the US. Again, if you're not able to make it, please submit your questions ahead of time. We'll probably get to those first, and especially those that get asked the most. So this episode, we begin to look at some of the earliest stages of human history. We've been working, generally speaking, from the present backwards in time, beginning by looking at the question of who do we living peoples come from, given all of our diversity and differences, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, what's the connections among us? And then we've been moving backwards in time and saying, how do we connect back to these ancient peoples? Could there be relationships between these ancient cultures and you and me that we didn't appreciate before? Early in the series, I promised that we'd deliver on a number of these items. We've seen in previous episodes the answers to many of these things. 19 covered the first point, that there's Caucasians walking around who've had dark-skinned people in their family tree and don't know it. From episodes about 7 through 10 covered a lot of the European side of the equation, 17 as well about the Vikings. The episodes numbered about 11 through 16 covered the pre-Columbian history of the Americas. And now we're finally getting back to this very early stage. So this episode will hit the Neanderthals. Our next episode will hit some of the earliest stages of human history, and then we'll wrap it all up, doing a fast forward, put all the pieces together. Here's what human history looks like now in light of the genetics that we've discussed. That'll be episode 23. And my goal is partially apologetic, so that if you're a creationist, you'll have new tools to defend your faith. And if you're not a creationist watching, you'll have your views challenged. And that beyond all of the apologetic purposes, we'd be moved and prompted towards marveling at the stories of who we are and how we got here. And ultimately that we praise God for his sovereign rule of history. That's something every person needs to wrestle with by the time we finish this. We've seen all these connections. Is history one random linked chain of events that have no purpose, no goal, or is there a sovereign hand that guides all this? And what does the scripture tell us? So my goal is that people would marvel. Now, if you look at the mainstream account for who we are and how we got here, the story of human origins begins primitive and brutish and animal-like. We're not humans at the beginning. The immediate ancestors to humans are ape-like creatures. They're not capable, they're not advanced, they're not intelligent by human standards, they're animals. And then at some point, about 200,000 years ago, roughly, on the savannas of Africa, the first anatomically modern humans arose. But then there's another big pause, so to speak. The next 100,000 years, again, roughly speaking, because these numbers change in the mainstream scientific model, for about 100,000 years, they just roam Africa. So to put this in perspective, we've been talking about heavily the history of civilization, the most recent 4,000 years of history. Well, the 100,000 years of Africa is the history of civilization, 4,000 years, played over and over and over again. It's 25 times worth of that. So you get some sense then for the enormous amounts of time built into the evolutionary model. So eventually people come out of Africa. They have to deal with the ice age, especially if they're in the northern hemisphere. Some of them live in caves. It's still a primitive existence. Finally, maybe about 12,000 years ago, the agricultural revolution hits. This allows for the advancement of the human race. We see evidence for advancement in ancient structures like Stonehenge. The ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. We see cities like Petra. This is some of the old world examples. If you go to the new world, you see that pre-Columbian peoples building sites on top of mountains like Machu Picchu. But humanity doesn't really kick into an advanced stage until the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, where technology grows by gigantic leaps and bounds. And we see things like transatlantic ocean voyages and the beginnings of humans taking flight. And within short order, we come to our modern era, where we can go pretty much anywhere we want to in the globe, whenever we want to. And we're even sending people into space. Some of you may have watched the recent SpaceX launch of astronauts to the space station. So this evolutionary model has a clever appeal. And this is how I see it. And this is the larger question I want us to consider and discover an answer to that I don't think has been made in public before. The evolutionary model draws on our natural, intuitive understanding of progress of the last few hundred years. We all know that 2020 is dramatically different from 1750. There's been huge advances in the global technological progress. And we see some of that reflected. It's not been even. There's first world countries, second world countries, third world countries, and we talk about that because of this gigantic leap forward in our abilities as humans. And so the evolutionary model draws on that naturally. Yeah, there's been a lot of progress. The past is less advanced than today, and it just extends it back in time. Why wouldn't you think that if you go even further back in time, beyond 1750, to the ancient times, that people were much more primitive than they are today? It takes this curve of history where we're really advanced now, or less so just a few hundred years ago. Well, why wouldn't we have been very unadvanced, very primitive in the past? It's this inevitable march of progress that summarizes the essential idea of human evolution. And it summarizes the intuitive emotional appeal that it has, because we understand the advance, the progress of the last few hundred years. Why wouldn't we simply extend it into the past? It just seems to make sense. So where do Neanderthals fit into this larger picture? They're viewed as and depicted as primitive. And the dates that are given to their origins and demise fit the ancient evolutionary timescale. They're typically depicted as arising hundreds of thousands of years ago, coexisting with anatomically modern humans, and then going extinct, maybe 30,000 years ago. So in this inevitable march of progress, they get stuck way back in the primitive era. So who were these people? Where did they come from? How did they arise? And what happened to them? Because we're now at episode 21, I'm not going to review all the previous episodes where we covered everything from ancient China, pre-Columbian Americas, modern and ancient Europe. You can find all those again on the YouTube channel, or more importantly, find it on Answers TV, where you can see all these episodes, watch them wherever you want to. So again, I'll point you there instead of reviewing all that and taking up time from this episode. Instead, I want to think more deeply about this question of who are the Neanderthals. And if you've watched the previous episodes, especially those on the origin and fate of the Native Americans, you'll immediately recognize that this question of the Neanderthals is a place that we've already been before. And this is the parallel. We saw, especially in episode 11, that the stereotypes of Native Americans as primitive peoples, leftovers from the Stone Age, the Paleolithic era, these sorts of things. And you look at some of the practices, especially in the Amazon jungle, and why wouldn't people think that? Those stereotypes are wrong. And we know they're wrong because, of all things, mainstream archaeology is overturning them. This book, 1491, written in 2005, documents some of these advances. We looked at other advances since then. This field is changing so fast, it's hard to keep up with. This is a paper from 2018 where we looked at these authors' examination of a cloud forest in Ecuador. So you think, okay, save the Amazon, the jungle. One of the stereotypes is the Native Americans are these peace-loving people living in harmony with nature, never touching it for thousands of years, and the Europeans came in and destroyed it. Well, if you look at the archaeological record of this particular cloud forest in Ecuador, and you can date the layers. I think they were looking at lake sediments. You can date them with carbon-14. It works for the most recent times. In a few minutes, we'll talk about what happens for ancient times. So you can look at these layers. You can look at the plant materials. Is there pollen grains? Are there plant remains consistent with the cloud forest? And the topmost layers, yes, it fits. But you dig down into layers that are just a few centuries ago, and you begin to see plant material consistent with an opened grassland, not jungle. And you dig down even further to the pre-European times. And what you find are maize grains, in other words, farmland. Cloud forest was not always a cloud forest, and it's been so only for a few centuries. So these people were transforming their environment. They were building massive structures, intricate pyramids, these massive buildings, and they look the way they do today. And our erroneous label of primitive comes from a misunderstanding of their history and stems largely from the massive population collapse they underwent. And we looked at some of the discussions and the debate over how many people were here on the eve of Columbus's arrival, and saw that there's evidence to suggest there were as many people in the Americas in 1491 as there were in all of Europe. And this, of course, dramatically changed over the next 3 centuries, where these people dropped in numbers to under 10 million, whereas the number of European immigrants and European people multiplying in the Americas just exploded. So this idea that they were primitive, the author of 1491 says, is similar and analogous to someone being dropped into Nazi Germany at the end of World War II, going to a concentration camp, seeing these emaciated people and thinking, oh, they must have always been part of a culture that had been barefoot and starving. They must have always been primitive. And of course, we know that's completely wrong. These people, as Mann succinctly puts and accurately puts, are survivors of a recently shattered culture. And if you understand what happened prior, you can make much more sense of who they are and why they are the way they are today. So if you have that background in mind, and you think of yet another primitive peoples, you begin to wonder if this is not the result of the inevitable march of progress from simple to complex, but perhaps the result of an ancient catastrophe or population collapse. But before we can dig deeper into that explanation and explore it and evaluate it, we have to tie up some loose ends that are leftovers from mainstream science. First of all, and perhaps most importantly, is the question of the time scale. What do you do with that? Hundreds of thousands of years ago, they arose. Tens of thousands of years ago, they disappeared. What is the timing of their existence? These dates are obviously in conflict with the scriptures. and they're in conflict with the Y chromosome data we've been exploring. So just to stop for a moment and review what we've been discussing. The main tool by which we've been interrogating human history is the male inherited DNA, the Y chromosome. In episodes 5 and 6, we looked at the reasons why it's this instead of other types of DNA, why it's this and not the $100 tests you can take through Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, one of these other commercial testing companies. This is the tool, the basis for exploring European, Chinese, African, Pacific, all these other places. That history, that's the basis for it. That data seems to conflict then with the state. And we've looked at the main tool. It has a basis in the existence of a clock. This Y chromosome is copied erroneously every generation. About 2 to 3 mistakes happen. And so that these differences add up over time, and the number of differences between you and me, between me and Ken, are a reflection of the time since we last had a common ancestor. So if Ken and I have a lot of differences at the Y chromosome level between us, our common male ancestor must be in the distant past. If we have just a few differences between us, our common ancestor must be much more recent than we thought. I don't actually know how close or distantly related we are, but the Y chromosome can tell us. And the reason we got so excited, one of the main smoking guns of the recent origin of the human race in the Y chromosome was a match between 2 types of data. The first type of data was the history of human population growth derived from archaeology and written records. So, for example, the Roman Empire kept a census of how many citizens they had. The Chinese Empire did the same. You can use that to say, okay, how many people were living here? You can also use archaeological remains. How big is this city? How many people would it require to sustain it? How much manpower do you need to build this pyramid? Those sorts of things you can use to derive estimates. And that's why there's 2 lines here. It's going to be a little bit of guesswork, but this gives you a decent range of what the global population size looked like. We also looked at the ways in which you can use genetic differences to, of all things, reconstruct the human population history. The simple explanation is the number of branches in each of our family trees reflects the number of people. And you just extrapolate that and apply that globally. The global human family tree, the number of branches on it, is going to reflect the number of people alive at any point in time in history. And so when you reconstruct the human population history from the Y chromosome, it matches very tightly what we know from archaeology and from written records. And the archaeology and written records from this time, 1000 BC going forward, those data, the blue line, is evidence the evolutionists agree with. And yet it's only the young Earth reconstruction, the reconstruction of human population history from the Y chromosome within a young Earth framework that accurately recapitulates this. This is remarkable. Where does Neanderthal DNA fit, though? You may have read in the news and seen announcements of we've got Neanderthal DNA. Maybe you've taken a DNA test and they say, oh, you're 4%, 2% Neanderthal. How does this fit? Let me tee it up this way. If you follow the creation evolution debate closely, you might have seen the question of Neanderthal DNA brought up as an argument against the young Earth timescale. Why? If you look at the number of Neanderthal DNA differences between them and us being modern humans, there are far more differences between us and them than between any 2 people alive today. And so if we use this concept of a genetic clock, we say, okay, how many differences exist between us? How many mistakes happen per generation? How can we dial the clock back to 0? How long does it take? Critics of young Earth creation science would say you can't do that in 6,000 years, 4,500 years. There's too many differences to explain. So therefore, your model is wrong. Well, what do you do with that? This is tied to this question of timescale. It's an argument for their ancient timescale. Well, if you've watched episode 19, you might recall us discussing these long branches among sub-Saharan Africans. Some sub-Saharan Africans, others do not have these long branches. And I've been orienting the tree back here, saying Noah is somewhere back here, and time moves from left to right. And we discussed how we explain these branches. No, this does not represent mutations that happen in the future. What I argued for and showed evidence for was that this seems to suggest some of these Africans, that their clock ticks slightly faster than people elsewhere, even other people in sub-Saharan Africa. And there's probably some just genetic factor that is the reason for this. The evolutionists say no. All clocks tick at the same rate. you need to completely reorient the tree like this paper does and put those long branches back here. Again, time moves from left to right. We're not going to zoom in here, but the red, Africa, these red African branches come off first, therefore originated in Africa, and we did so a long time ago. Now, I bring this up because if you add a Neanderthal DNA, they show up then even older than these African lineages. Now, young earthers have been saying, rightly so, for many years, that Neanderthals are the descendants of Noah and his family. They're post-flood peoples who died out. So you need to explain them within 4,500 years. How do you explain these long branches? How do you explain all these DNA differences? Well, there's a similar principle at play here that we saw in our discussion of African DNA. So we saw in our discussion of these long branches among Africans, no one's actually directly measured the rate at which Africans mutate their DNA. It's all based on an assumption right now. They assume that the Africans mutate their DNA faster than others. And we've already seen probably the strongest smoking gun yet that they must mutate theirs faster. We're still waiting on someone to actually measure it. Well, Neanderthals are gone. We can't measure the father-son rate at which their DNA mutates. So that's one assumption they have to make, that their DNA clock ticks at the same rate that ours does, and that doesn't perhaps tick really fast and mutate really fast. The other assumption that they make is that this DNA is reliable. And the reason I bring this up is because of my own personal experience working with DNA in the lab. We were, when I was an undergraduate, working as an example with plant material. We're using single-celled algae to understand photosynthesis, this chemical process by which plants harvest light energy from the sun and so forth. We're studying the biology, the chemistry of plants. And we'd isolate DNA from these algae, stick it in the freezer, put it in special solution, and yet still in controlled conditions in the ideal scientific environment to keep this DNA preserved, it would degrade naturally. That's just second law of thermodynamics at work. And so after a year, it'd give weird results. And because it wasn't worth our time to try to figure out why it was giving weird results, we just throw it away and isolate some new stuff. Well, here you have DNA that's been sitting in the ground, even by young Earth standards, for thousands of years. Why wouldn't that be degraded? Well, here's the interesting thing. Even evolutionists admit, yes, the DNA is degraded, but they say we've eliminated the degraded parts, and what we're presenting to you is bona fide sequence, real sequence. Well, how do you know that's true? It's an assumption. They assume it's real, not degraded. It's not an artifact of some sort of chemical degradation process. And they assume that the Neanderthal clock ticks the same at ours. Well, there's a way to test those assumptions. Similar to the same way we tested the question of the African branches. What happens if you put Noah back here? You basically say, no, either it's degraded or their clock ticks too fast. If either of those is true, then it's basically irrelevant to our discussion. Well, if you take that position, you put Noah right there, we've already seen you get a 95% match between the Y chromosome-based data and the data from archaeology and historical records. Well, what if you say, no, the DNA of Neanderthals is reliable, and it ticks at the same rate as humans, and we need to completely reorient the tree. The start is way back here. It's not up here where I've been saying. You've got to, they don't branch off Africans. They're some of the first post-flood peoples, and they must have originated in the last 4,500 years. What happens if you try to reconstruct human population history that way, just like we saw for the question of reorienting the tree based on the African sequences? You get a very poor match. The match between the tan lines and the blue lines is 14%, not 95%. And you can see this more in the papers I published in December. You just go to our website and type in my name, look for these papers, and the answer is Research Journal. My point is, this is very good indirect evidence that either the DNA is degraded and or their clock ticks at a different rate than ours does. Either way, it is not a legitimate argument against the young Earth timescale. And what it also sadly means is that the DNA is not useful for further investigation. So we can reject this date as scientifically inaccurate. Well, what is the story of their time of origin and then the time of their demise? If this time scale is wrong, what can we do? And if we can't get at their DNA, what can we say about their history? Let's go back to this graph, because there's a clue to Neanderthals in the DNA of modern people. It works like this. So if we draw a line right here to represent 1000 BC, I've been arguing that the overlap between the tan lines and the blue lines is really tight. Basically, this is an argument that when you're looking at human population history based on the Y chromosome, you're looking at something highly accurate. The match to the right of the purple line, between the blue and the tan, gives me confidence that whenever I'm looking to the left of it, I'm looking at real history. In other words, the match to the right of the line argues that I can simply look to the left of the line and get information. So if I say how many people were alive in 1200 or 1700 BC, I just draw a line over from the tan to this axis, and I can get the number of people alive. Now, this is a new concept that we'll dig into more in a moment. And I want to show you how this is going to bring us closer to the story of Neanderthals. So let's take this in steps. If you didn't follow what I just did, well, stick with me. We're going to explain this in more detail in a moment. Recall from episodes 19 and 20, we discussed the question of where exactly Noah is. And there still is some uncertainty. I've been going in this series with where I think the best guess for Noah is. It may be revised as more research comes in. This is research in progress. I'm presenting one possibility and the one that I think is best supported by the evidence at the moment. So the position where I think Noah is best supported is back here where there's two branches coming off of him, not three, and we'll discuss why there's not three. Some in this episode and then even more so in the next episode. After about 500 to 700 years of people living after Noah, there's a whole bunch of branches that then start diversifying, as if there's a second Babel-like event where the major ethno-linguistic groups of the world start splitting and separating and going their separate ways. We saw in episode 20 that this has a very intriguing overlap with an event in Genesis 41 that sounds very global. The famine of Joseph's day, where he was made second in command of Egypt to preserve people, it says, from all countries, all lands. And the timing of this event is right in line with the timing of the event I just showed you. Okay, well, what does this have to do with Neanderthals? Remember that I said the match over here between tan and blue means I can just use the tan by itself to figure out population sizes, which means I can go back from the Y chromosome and tell you, read off from this graph, how many people were alive in the entire planet during the famine of Joseph. This brings us closer to the question of Neanderthals. So 500 and 750 years post-flood, during this time of Joseph's famine, how many people were alive? Well, we're looking at the Y chromosome male inheritance, so we can read off the number of males. I just double it to get the number of females, to get the total population. Based on the Y chromosome data, even if you didn't follow exactly how I did it, my point is we can use genetics to learn how many people were alive on the planet at various points in history, even the most ancient points in history, which gets us, then again, close to this question of Neanderthals. 5 to 10 million males, 10 to 20 million people total on the globe in the time of Joseph's famine. We'll get into some of these details more in the next episode, but if you were watching episode 20 and thought, I just have trouble thinking that all the earth came to Egypt, because how do you get people from the Americas? Well, how does that question change for you if you know that there's only 10 to 20 million people total alive on the entire globe at the time of Joseph's famine? That's just a few large cities by today's standards. How far did they spread? Did they even make it to the Americas by the time of Joseph's famine? There aren't that many people there. I'm going to put pause on that for the moment and go even deeper in history. We've got still this outstanding question of what about the 500, 600 years before Joseph's famine? All we have is this branch and this branch. We don't have other branches coming off. What can we say about that earliest point in history? Now, we're really pushing the limits of what these data can say. This is research in progress. What I want to show you, though, is one model that I think makes a lot of sense. More research will lead to the evaluation of it. The bigger point I want to make here is something that the question of plausibility. So the question I'm now trying to answer is, what happened between Noah and really Babel and Joseph, the several centuries in between them? How many people were alive at each stage? Well, we know from scripture there were 4 males, and again I'm talking males because we're thinking Y chromosome. 4 males immediately post-flood, Noah and his 3 boys. We've learned from the Y chromosome that at the time of Joseph's day, there were 5 to 10 million males. We don't really have Y chromosome data at the present to fill in the gap, but we can start running some models. One question we can ask is, what would it take to go from 4 males to the number of males alive in Joseph's day in the low millions? Well, if you run the math, all you need is a growth rate of 3 to 4 kids per couple. That number is less than population doubling. So as an example, my wife and I have 4 kids. Our population is doubling. It's gone from 2 to 4. If my kids grow up and they each have 2 kids each, or 4 kids each in their families, doubling, doubling, doubling. That's less than population doubling. That's entirely reasonable, is my point. It doesn't take much to go from Noah to Joseph in that time period. Now, you might say, well, my family doesn't have population doubling. Maybe you only have 1 sibling, 2 siblings. Maybe you're the only child. You look at other places around the globe, maybe it's not population doubling. I don't know what I think of it. My point is that it's plausible. Whether or not it's probable is something we can evaluate with relevant data. And the most relevant data are the data that come from the historical record of the immediate aftermath of Babel, the list of peoples in Genesis 10. Genesis 10 gives us genealogies of Noah's sons' generation, then how many sons they had, and how many sons some of their offspring had. And if you take the average of Shem, Ham, and Japheth's lineages, immediately following the flood, they were not undergoing population doubling. They were undergoing something much faster. The average number of kids per couple in Genesis 10 is 7 to 8, not 3 to 4. So when I say what you need as a minimum to go from Noah to Joseph is something even less than what the scripture says is going on. Now, remember that when we're at Joseph's time, we're talking about a famine. Famines have this nasty habit of killing people because they die of starvation. So what may have happened is that there was rapid reproductive growth following the flood, and the famine of Joseph's day put a big damper on that and may have killed off some people. The theological point, of course, we see in Genesis 41 is God preserving the lineage of Jacob because of his promise to Abraham. But everyone else is benefiting. Some may not have benefited. Who knows? The point is, this is extremely plausible. It works very well, and it's even less than what Genesis 10 is saying is going on. Now, let me add one more point in here, because we're talking about Genesis chapter 10. Because we discussed in a previous episode, where's the line of Japheth or of Ham or of Shem? If I'm proposing Noah is where I think he is, and you've only got 2 major branches coming off, where's the 3rd boy? Well, if you look at Genesis 10, we might have a partial answer, and we'll discuss this even more in the next episode. The number of offspring from each of these lineages is not equal. Shem and Ham have roughly the same number of offspring, around 30. Japheth has half that number. Now, if you go back to episode 4, where we talked about differential rates of reproduction, there we were looking at about a 20% difference. If one group of people, let's say a small group of Africans, perhaps slaves from Africa, were brought to Europe in the 1400s, but they reproduced maybe 20% faster. Very small difference. They can be the dominant ancestors of everyone else in just a few centuries. Well, if Ham and Shem are reproducing twice as fast as Japheth, it doesn't take long for their lineages to outcompete Japheth's in short order. Now, some of you have messaged me and pointed out there's a verse in Genesis 9, I'd forgotten about this, where it talks about Japheth dwelling in the tents of Shem. Could that be what it's referring to? I don't know. It's a very intriguing verse to consider, and I can't give you the exegesis of it at the moment. My point here is, looking at the math and the data that we have at Babel, we already see one of these lineages behind the 8 ball, so to speak. One of these is reproducing slowly, or much more slowly than the rest. And this may have long-term consequences that we'll explore in more depth in the next episode. Here's something else though to consider. We're taking these points rapid fire because there's so much to be uncovered here at the earliest points in history, and so much to be rewritten in contrast to mainstream science. Let's use this model, and again, it's a model, but let's dig deeper at the implications. If I use this math and say, okay, if you take this rate, 3.66 kids per couple, and then you make some assumptions about after this many generations, the previous generations die out, and you run a population model that'll get you from 4 males to 5 to 10 million males in a few centuries. You can then use that model to say, okay, at this century, and at this century, and at this century, in between Noah and Joseph, how many people were alive? For example, Abraham is born 300 to 400 years post-flood. Can we run this model to ask the question, how many people were alive on the planet at the time of Abraham? Well, we can do it. Whether or not it's true is another question. But if you run the model says at the time of Abraham, there were only 50,000 to 300,000 people alive in total in the entire globe. So when you read about the kings, the 5 kings of the nations, the Gentiles, in Genesis chapter 14, with whom Abraham eventually has to do battle, or anyway, you know that story. Were these the only kings alive on the planet? If there's only 50,000 to 300,000 people alive in total, this really gets the wheels turning. Well, there's so much more we could discuss there. I'm going to leave that aside for the moment because the question we're trying to get at is the question of Neanderthals. All this is prelude to getting at the question of the time scale of Neanderthal origins and demise. Well, all we have so far for Neanderthals are the mainstream timescale for their origin and demise. Well, it turns out the mainstream timescale is a tool that we can use to rewrite their history. And this is how it works. It's a 4-step process. This is, again, research in progress. The numbers may change as we do more research, but I think this gives us a general idea of the shape and type of conversion that we can do with genetics, of all things. So I'm not going to get into geology. You can read much of the stuff on our website about the geologic considerations about radiometric dating and carbon-14 dating and all that sort of stuff. I'm a biologist. I leave those sorts of discussions to my geology and astronomy colleagues and physics colleagues. Here's what we can do with genetics. So let's think about the evolutionary model again. They agree that from 1000 BC onward, history matches what young Earth creationists would think. Prior to that, there's, of course, divergence. Now, here's what I want you to see. There's 2 things in this graph. There's a time scale on this axis. So, of course, they have an ancient history hundreds of thousands of years ago, but they have ideas about human population growth 2000 BC, 4000, 10,000. They say around 12,000 BC is this agricultural evolution, roughly. Well, this is based on archaeology, and using archaeology, they infer population sizes. So they will say in 10,000 BC, there were 4 million people alive on the planet. My point is they have this model for the history of human population growth going into the ancient past. This allows us to do a 4-step process by which to convert evolutionary dates to young Earth calendar ones. Here's how it works. Step 1 is you find the evolutionary carbon-14 date. So as an example, let's take 10,000 BC. Okay, we've got our date, carbon-14 date, something like that. Then you find the evolutionary population size associated with it. So in this case, as I mentioned, they would say in 10,000 BC, there were 4 million people alive. We're talking Y chromosomes, so just divide it by 2. 2 million males. Fine, what does that matter? Well, step 3 is take that evolutionary population size and find that same number in the Y chromosome curve. So I said we can trust the numbers back here because they match over here, and we can find the numbers on this axis. So you say, okay, where's 2 million people on this axis? So that's step 3. You find it there on the right side of this curve. And using this horizontal line, you find where it intersects the yellow, and you draw a line down, and now you've got the young Earth calendar date. Even if you didn't follow all of those steps, we have a way by which we can convert evolutionary carbon-14 dates, the dates assigned to Neanderthals. We can convert them to calendar dates, and the link is the history of human population growth recorded in genetics. So we're not going to go through all the math. This is something I've already done, and this is the result. A very early preliminary result. This is a result based on a young Earth timescale using the Masoretic text and a long sojourn in Egypt. If you're a Septuagint person or a short sojourn, you can redraw all of these graphs. The ministry doesn't get into that debate. As an official position, I'm just using the Masoretic here in the long sojourn, and this is what falls out. I want to point out a couple of key features in this graph. Number 1, you have these 3 tan lines over here. That represents the range of flood dates. The solid line is the average. The dotted lines are the range. What do you mean a range? Well, there is some uncertainty in the text, and I don't mean, oh, we can insert thousands or millions of years. No, what I mean is, when you're doing a chronology and you say, okay, this man fathered this son when he was this old. Well, when it says he was this old, is that a week before his next birthday? Is it a week after his previous birthday? There might be a play of about a year. Well, what difference does a year make? Well, if you have 50 generations of 1 year being in question, now you might have a 50-year uncertainty. It's not a big uncertainty. You notice this is a difference of about 50 years to a century. My point is we don't want to be more precise than what the Bible says. This is a young earth timescale. It's very clear, but let's recognize that there's also some uncertainty, I think, in one of the lineages of the kings. I think the date exactly of when Solomon reigned relative to the Exodus, there's again a very small uncertainty there. So don't be intimidated or scared off by, what do you mean there's a range? Just recognize when you try to be very precise with the text, there's still even some debate among conservative, good young earth scholars. So you can read a paper by Rob Carter and Chris Hardy, which goes into these nitty-gritty details in all its glory, if you're interested. These lines right here are the date for Joseph's famine. Again, the average and the range. And there's a little bit of uncertainty for the same reasons I just mentioned. The blue lines represent the way by which we can convert dates. So here are the evolutionary dates in BC. Here are the young earth calendar dates in BC. And this is negative, this is positive. Why? That doesn't make any sense. Well, because it makes the graph easier to read. So just recognize what I'm doing. Apologize for the confusion. Evolutionary BC dates, creation BC dates, and you find where these two intersect, and you can convert it. And I'll give you an example more in a moment, because this will make it easier to understand. There are two blue lines because, again, of some of the uncertainties in terms of establishing the very strict, tight chronology, and because there's inherent statistical variation in biological data. But notice, we're not talking about a variation of millions of years. We're talking about a variation of maybe a century or two. Not a big deal. Okay, Neanderthals. Where do they fall out in this graph? What can we learn about their story from this graph? 30,000 years ago is the mainstream date. Well, the top date that we have here is 10,000, not 30,000. But we can still make a conclusion. 10,000 years ago, you draw a line over, find where it intersects the first blue line, or the second one. Then you draw a vertical line down. 10,000 years ago would represent somewhere between 2100 and 2200 BC. Or if you do the line over this way, somewhere between 1900 and 2000 BC. 30,000 years ago to represent something even more early than that. Now, based on the geography of the Neanderthal fossils, they seem to have been spreading out. Spreading out doesn't happen until after Babel. And in my view, this is not the official AIG view, but I lean towards Babel being within about a century after the flood. I think that makes a lot of sense. Maybe a century or two. So they're somewhere after that based on their geography. And based on converting the mainstream time points to young earth time points, so it's here or earlier, or maybe here or earlier, both of those seem to be before the famine. So what we can say based on the dates, so we can still use genetics based on living peoples, but these genetics of living peoples give us a new tool by which to convert mainstream dates. These people appear to have migrated away out from Babel and died out before the famine. Okay, well, what does that tell us? Back to the Native Americans. We said these so-called primitive-looking peoples are that way, not because they've been living in Stone Age technology for thousands of years and always been primitive. They were highly advanced, but their civilization collapsed. And those we see today are the survivors of a recently shattered culture. The shattering came about because of the arrival of Europeans, diseases, enslavement, and so forth. Those are not applicable at the dates we're looking at for Neanderthals. However, in episode 20, we looked at other events, biblical events, such as caravan, the migration of people to Egypt at the time of Joseph's famine, and conquest, as well as confusion, the Tower of Babel. Conquest being the mixing and migration and pillaging of other peoples that's happened ever since Babel. Looking at Israel's history, we saw that point. All of those would be at play. all three of those events, confusion, caravan, conquest, have, by their nature, the potential to upend and shatter a civilization and culture. The Neanderthals appear to have survived Babel. Now, the judgment purpose of Babel was to shatter civilizations. That's what God said. He said they're building a tower to heaven. Look at what they're doing. What's going to stop them from doing anything further? Let's confuse their languages. It's to inhibit what they were doing. That's the judgment. That'll inhibit what they're able to do technologically. This guy has this set of knowledge. This guy has this set of knowledge. Now they can't talk to each other and share it. It's been a very effective judgment. Part of the reason I think we haven't had technological progress like we've had, except until the last few hundred years, is because we can't speak to each other. We've had to recover some of that lost knowledge. It's taken a long time. God's judgment in Genesis 11 has lasted thousands of years. It's going to affect the Neanderthals and other cultures. A famine would affect them. The dates seem to be like, it looks like they died out before the famine. So another possible explanation for their demise is conquest. We looked at the history of Israel to see the sad history of their conquest by the peoples because of their sin, God's divine judgment. So there's a divine hand, but we also know that it's also a consequence of human sin. In Genesis 10, Nimrod is called a mighty hunter before the Lord. Do you think conquest set in centuries after Babel? Or did conquest start happening right away? Were human hearts any different from before the flood, where they were thinking of new ways to do evil and kill each other? I don't think so. I don't think history bears that out. I don't think the scripture bears that out. We all have the same depraved heart that only Christ can redeem. So could Neanderthals have died out at the hands of fellow Babel survivors? I think it's entirely plausible. Did conquest, as a rule of thumb, kick in as soon as Babel ended? I think so. And if you're thinking about the population sizes, so if in Abraham's day there's only 50,000 people, and one of the subgroups within this 50,000 decides they're going to go conquer the others, that conquest might not be just the overtaking of one group by another. It might lead to the extinction of one. So those are all things to keep in mind when we think about the Neanderthals. Today's Native Americans, so-called primitive peoples, we saw in previous episodes, apparently wiped out those who were here first. And now today, they've been nearly wiped out by those who came in after, the Europeans. What about the Neanderthals? They survived Babel. Did they survive the conquest that likely ensued thereafter? I want to return to this larger point, though, of the inevitable march of progress. Neanderthals are often stuck back here. And there's this natural, well, they look dumb, old, primitive. What do we do with that? Even if we convert their time scale and put them in a biblical context, yes, there's this possibility they were wiped out by someone around them. Maybe they succumbed to the effects of the Ice Age. We have a temporal context in which to place their origins in existence. What about this idea, though, of inevitable march of progress? Well, here's, I think, a larger point that's not been made before, that I think is emotionally satisfying and biblically consistent. What do we do with the fact that there's, yes, unambiguous, gigantic leaps of progress in the last few centuries? Why wouldn't we extrapolate that into the past? Well, we've already seen, based on Native Americans and in Scripture, that catastrophes can take an advanced people and make them look primitive. Same thing can apply to the Neanderthals. And so history is filled with the rise and fall of peoples based on conquest. And your ability to survive a conquest, or not do it, has a relationship to the size of your peoples. Some of it, of course, there's a disease role, but if you're a large population and this tiny minority comes in and tries to wipe you out, chances are the larger population is going to win. And the smaller population is going to have to revert to a primitive state because they've just been destroyed. We've been looking at human population history heavily over and over in each episode. And what's intriguing to me is the rule of thumb is fairly level growth, even growth for thousands of years and a sharp uptick in the last few hundred, one that seems to coincide with the leaps and bounds of progress that we've seen. So this seeming move from primitive to complex, to me, is not the inevitable march of progress. It's the inevitable march of populations. It's not some evolutionary story of how we keep advancing. People are advanced and then they go primitive, and advance and go primitive depending on who conquered them and who else they can conquer. And the recent uptick seems to be a byproduct of just how many people there are on this globe. We've had a sharp uptick in peoples. Knowledge has increased, has been sharing, and there's so many more hands to be put to the task of advancing technology. This is not some evolutionary story. Human history is a reflection of changes in population growth. And Neanderthals are at the earliest stages when population sizes were small, and the chance of going permanently extinct because it got wiped out were much higher. In our next episode, we'll look at the fate of the survivors of these ancient conquests and try to put the pieces together there at the earliest stages of human history in this new history of the human race. I hope you'll join us next time.
Well, Dr. Jeanson, that is absolutely fascinating. And, you know, I remember a couple of things. I remember when I went to school as a teenager, high school. It seems like a long time ago. I remember my teacher showing me a movie, how, you know, humans evolved about 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. In fact, going back to their ape-like ancestor, you know, 5 to 8 million years ago, but 200 to 300 years ago. And they showed you this graph and said, you know, they started using stone tools and things. And, you know, first of all, they were hunter-gatherers and learned to farm. And then for all this time, the population just stayed flat. And then suddenly, just a few thousand years ago, it goes up. And I often even thought back then, if you cut off most of that flat line, you know, because they would say, oh, well, they must have had children, but they died out or whatever. They were all primitives, etc. And it wasn't until they started to develop some technology over here, suddenly it takes up. But what you're showing is, you know, that first part of that, all that flat graph is gone. That's our evolutionary story. And if you take what we actually are observing, it just fits beautifully with what the Bible's teaching. And so I know we've talked about that in previous episodes. Okay, I've got a question for you. Now, if people want to put their questions in the comments, then not tomorrow for the program tomorrow for number 22, but for number 24, that'll be the following week. 23 is the final one, then 24, we're going to have a question time. And questions that are submitted, you'll try to answer those. And also, we should be able to have questions coming in live as well. But my question for you right now is, or maybe you haven't done this, and maybe you'll do it for next episode, but how many people do you think were alive at the Tower of Babel? Have you done that model? I mean, you said how many you thought might have been alive at the time of Abraham, 50 to 300,000. What do you think about the Tower of Babel? If it was, say, 100, what do you say, 100 to 200, 130 years after the flood, I've heard some people say, around about that sort of time.
My view is based on a couple of different things in the scriptures, less so the Y chromosome. And I know there's debate in exactly when Babel happened. I tend to take the division of the earth in the days of Peleg as referring to Babel, not necessarily plate tectonics, these sorts of things. And I think many of the geology folks would agree with that.
Yes.
They step on a few toes, but I think textually that makes sense.
Yeah, in context, says, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. 11:1, the whole earth was one language, one speech. So if that's the division, and someone else had also pointed out to me back when I was at ICR that it's intriguing if you, again, think about the text in context. You let the scripture interpret scripture. They're all one language, one speech. Genesis seems to be a collection of first-person accounts, people saying, I was there, I saw it, and I wrote it down. And then perhaps Moses collects it and then edits these sorts of things. A debate on that, but that's the view I like. It's almost as if you have someone who's there at the time of the flood, recording what's happening. These are the people I knew in Genesis 10. Then Babel hits. I can't tell you anymore. I can't talk to them. I can't tell you what happened to this lineage, that lineage. But those who were there at the time that Babel hit, here they are in Genesis 10. I'm writing them down for you. And then language is confused and we parted ways. So based on the numbers there, 70 heads of families, and then saying, okay, they have wives, they probably have many kids. I have a hard time thinking that God's going to give a child a new language and think they're going to survive. To me, those are likely heads of families, perhaps extended families. So using that number and saying, okay, let's add in women, children, perhaps extended family units, I'm thinking maybe about 1,000 around the time of Babel. These people separate. So it's very small numbers of sinful, depraved people, one of whom is Nimrod, who's a mighty hunter. And they've just had their plans frustrated. How are they going to vent that frustration? I'm not sure they do so peacefully. So I don't know how many of those lineages would be expected to survive until the present day. Yes, he separates them, but we've seen what happens in Israel's history with human hearts. We've seen God's divine judgment of that. We see his divine judgment of the nations, as well as think of some of those people that are listed. Canaanites, God commands the Israelites to wipe them out. So Babel is the first word, not the last word. My guess is about 1,000 people. And this is something to keep in mind then going forward as we think about what happened to their descendants, and then what sort of signature would they leave in today's world, which is what we're going to pick up then in episode 22.
And, I was also thinking, if they're going to build a tower, they had some technology, they had ability, they had talent. But then as they left that, and you have those 70 families, according to their language units, moving away from each other. Now, if I was the head of one of those, the Lord never gave me an ability to build anything. So you would come with me and we'd live in caves and we'd be the Neanderthals, right? But if it was my brother who has this ability to think three-dimensionally and just build houses, you would go with him and he'd build a city. So that's really the sort of thing we're looking at, aren't we?
Yes, exactly. And I wonder, again, the point is to make them spread out. They've disobeyed already. The command is spread out. Will they disobey again, even if it confuses the languages? Given the shattering of their cultures, how many of them are still somewhat interdependent on others? So they're here. God says spread. Do they want to spread all the way to the ends of the earth? Or they're going to say, well, I can't talk to you, but can we kind of wave our hands and try to undergo some sort of trade? This is a question I have in my mind still as we think about how quickly did they reach the ends of the earth. And we'll talk about the details of that from the Y chromosome next time as well.
Okay, episode 22, which will be tomorrow, searching for the earliest clues to human history. Who are Abraham's biological descendants? Can we identify them today? Can their DNA tell us what happened after the events of the Tower of Babel, but before the famine in Joseph's day that you were talking about? So in these earliest days of human history, what did happen? Which civilizations rose and fell? What did Abraham have to do with any of this? That's what you're going to talk about in the next one, episode 22. And if you missed all of the episodes, subscribe to answers.tv. That's our streaming service. It's a new streaming service from Answers in Genesis. We now have over 1,700 items up there on answers.tv, with more being added every day. And all this series is on there. And it works out at just over $3 a month. It's very, very inexpensive and high quality. And you can also go to YouTube, not the same quality as answers.tv, but we do have playlists there for you if you want to go to YouTube and use that. So Dr. Jeanson, thank you. And we look forward to talking about Abraham in the next episode, episode 22.